A hook isn't successful because students are entertained. A hook is successful because students are ready for what comes next. And today I want to show you the difference and why getting this one thing right changes everything about how the unit unfolds.
Welcome to the Secondary Teacher Podcast, the podcast for middle and high school teachers juggling multiple preps to get the strategies to reduce overwhelm so that you don't have to choose between being an effective teacher and prioritizing important relationships. I'm your host, Khristen Massic, a 10-year high school engineering teacher, former middle school assistant principal, and teacher coach. Every week, we will discuss strategies, systems, and time-saving tips to help you not only survive but thrive as a multiple prep teacher.
Last episode, we talked about the Introduce, Practice, Produce framework and why every lesson has a job. Today, we're going deep on the first phase, Introduce. Specifically, what an introduction lesson is actually supposed to do, because I think there's a really common misconception about this that's worth naming directly. In my teacher prep program, I was taught about anticipatory sets. The idea was that before you teach something, you do something to get students thinking, activate prior knowledge, create some curiosity, set the stage for the lesson. And I understood the concept, but honestly, a lot of times I couldn't figure out what the thinking should actually be. So I'd just jump in, start teaching, and tell myself I'd figure it out later, or maybe just really wasn't that important. Later usually didn't come. Then we had a professional development with Dave Burgess, the author of Teach Like a Pirate. And suddenly I had more hook ideas than I knew what to do with. And I loved it. I'd think about hooks, I'd plan hooks, I'd genuinely get excited about the opening of a lesson. But here's what I started to notice. I put so much energy into making the hook interesting, into making students ask questions and feel curious, that I'd lose the thread connecting it to everything that came after. The hook became the destination instead of the doorway. And I'd get to the end of a really engaging opening activity and think, okay, now what? And I think that's actually one of the most common traps in introduction lesson design. Not that teachers don't care about hooks, but that we've accidentally made the hook the goal, when really it's supposed to be the on-ramp. So let me reframe what an introduction lesson is actually supposed to do. It's not to entertain students. It's not to fill the first 10 minutes with something fun. It's to prepare students for the learning that's about to happen. Attention matters, but attention is the doorway, not the destination. The real job of an introduction lesson is to help students notice something, wonder about something, or question something, so that when the teaching starts, they're ready to receive it. Because once a student has a genuine question, now you have a reason to teach. And that's a completely different starting point than jumping straight into content. Let me show you what this looks like in practice using the unit I'm currently building live inside the unit planning lab. The course is 3D printing, and my instinct as someone who finds this content genuinely interesting was to start by explaining. Here's how a printer works. Here's what a slicer does. Here are the settings that matter and why. But I stopped myself, because if I explain all of that first, before students have experienced any of the problems those explanations solve, they're just listening to information they have no framework for yet. They don't know what they don't know. So instead, I asked a different question. What could students notice that would naturally make them curious? Not, how do I entertain them? Or how do I create a need to know? And that one shift completely changed how I thought about the beginning of the unit. Here are the 3 questions I now ask every time I'm planning the introduce phase of a unit. Question 1, what do I want students to notice? Not what do I want them to memorize? Not what vocabulary do they need? What should they observe? Sometimes that's looking at an example, sometimes it's comparing 2 things side by side, sometimes it's watching something happen and being asked to describe what they see. The goal is simply to get the students paying attention to the right thing before you tell them what to think about it. Question 2, what do I want students to wonder? This is where curiosity starts. What question do I hope students are asking by the end of this lesson? Because if students are naturally wondering something, you've created a reason for the rest of the unit to exist. In the 3D printing unit, I want students wondering why 2 printed objects that look identical might perform completely different. That question, once they're genuinely asking it, makes everything that comes next feel necessary instead of arbitrary. Question 3, what misconception might they bring in? This one has become my favorite, because if I already know where students are likely to get confused, I can intentionally design an experience that surfaces that misconception early, not to embarrass anyone, but to give us something real to build on. Misconceptions that get named early are misconceptions you can actually address. The ones that stay hidden show up later, usually on the assessment, when it's too late to do much about them. Let me bring you back to the 3D printing unit one more time, because I think the sequence matters. Later in the unit, students are going to experiment with different slicer settings. They're going to compare results. They're even going to destructively test printed objects to see how their decisions affected the final product. That's rich, meaningful learning. But if I start there, before students have the right questions, the learning actually becomes shallower because they're doing the activity without the curiosity that makes it matter. Every phase of a unit has a different job. The introduce phase isn't supposed to do the practice. It's not supposed to do the assessment. Its job is simply to prepare students for both. And when it does that job well, the rest of the unit gets easier to teach because students are coming to each phase with a question they actually want answered. I think about that Dave Burgess PD a lot when I work with teachers on introduction lessons now. His hook ideas are genuinely excellent, and the energy he brings to the question of how do you pull students into learning is something I still carry. But what I've learned since then is that a hook without a thread connecting it to the rest of the lesson is just a memorable opening. And memorable isn't the same as meaningful. The best introduction lessons aren't the ones that entertain students the most. They're the ones that leave students with a question they didn't have before they walked in. That question is the thread, and everything else in the unit gets to pull on it. If you're planning a unit this summer, before you search for hook ideas, before you open Pinterest, before you look for a fun activity to open with, ask yourself these two questions first. What do I want students to notice before I teach anything? And what question do I hope they're asking when they leave that first lesson? If your introduction creates a genuine need to know, the rest of the unit becomes much easier to teach. Next episode, we're moving into the second phase of the framework, practice. And specifically, why this is the phase most teachers rush through without realizing it. Because there's a difference between students completing an activity and students actually building understanding. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. If you're following along with the series, grab the free secondary teacher planning calendar from the show notes. It's designed to help you map out the full arc of a unit, introduce, practice, produce, before you start building individual lessons. So you can see the flow at a glance instead of planning one day at a time. And if you've been thinking, I wish someone could actually look at my unit with me and help me think through these decisions, that's exactly what we do inside the Unit Planning Lab. The next round opens in August. Join the waitlist in the show notes now for early access and first details when registration opens. Before you go, one question. Does your first lesson answer questions or create them? Because sometimes the best introduction isn't the one that explains the most. It's the one that gives students a reason to keep learning. Finish something that makes tomorrow lighter. See you next time.